attempt, but not until suffering severe casualties and being brought to a standstill. They could no longer continue their invasion. And so it proved to people all throughout the world that these patriots could in fact fight and hold their own against these British troops. And this gained a lot of support for the colonies, making it a very important strategic and moral victory for the colonists. At this time, we've just cruised by the opening of the Charles River. The Charles River Lock System is known as the Colonel Richard Gridley Lock System, whose Colonel Richard Gridley served at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and so that lock system is named in his honor for holding a great military force at bay, and now this lock system holds a great oceanic force at bay. We are now cruising by the north end of Boston over the starboard side, and rising up above the buildings is a steeple, a white steeple of the Old North Church. Its formal name is Christ Church of Boston, and that is where Paul Revere had the sexton Robert Newman hang two lanterns, and to shine one if by land and two if by sea, to warn which way the British troops were coming. On April 18th of 1775, two lanterns were lit, warning that the soldiers were coming by sea, well actually river, and so the Midnight Riders went off in their respective directions to warn people about what was happening. Now, many people do not know that the Midnight Riders were this nation's first intelligence agency. They were not just a group of messengers. They spied on British troop movements and carried secret messages, and Paul Revere was one of the leaders. Now, I believe he should be famous for that, but perhaps not for the ride of Paul Revere, because he didn't make it. He did not make it to Concord. He did not bring the message himself. He made it to Lexington with William Dawes, and they were joined by Samuel Prescott on the way to Concord, and they were captured. Only William Dawes and Samuel Prescott escaped, but William Dawes fell off of his horse and broke his leg. And it was Samuel Prescott, who had just left from being with his fiancée at 1 in the morning, who joined the Midnight Ride, made it to Concord, and brought the message to the soldiers there, where the shot heard round the world was fired on April 19th of 1775, the beginning of the Revolutionary War. We are now cruising by Constitution Wharf, formerly Edmund Hart's Shipyards. Edmund Hart's Shipyards is where the USS Constitution was built. Nowadays, this is the U.S. Coast Guard base. The motto of the Coast Guard is Semper Paratus, always ready. They were the oldest branch of the Navy. They were then transferred to Homeland Security, where they are the only military installment that is specifically charged with the saving of lives. Now, the Charles River used to extend all the way out this way to meet where these orange buildings are at Battery Wharf. It had a battery of cannons placed on it to guard the area, and all of that land was man-made now that it's been added here. Battery Wharf, where these orange brick buildings are, is also where the Massachusetts 54th Regiment departed as the first all-African-American regiment to serve during the Civil War. Now, these volunteers had to come into the city under cover of darkness to train, and there were so many volunteers for the 54th that they decided to form the 55th Massachusetts Regiment, as well as the 5th Cavalry of Massachusetts, and they were all very important African-American regiments, not to be forgotten in the shadow of Charles Gould Shaw's regiment, the 54th. There's a monument to them at the Boston Commons, and if you ever go there, you might find my friend Gerard. He is a Civil War reenactor. He serves as a storytelling commander of the 54th Regiment. And he goes there in full costume to take pictures to raise money for his regiment, as well as to inform people. We've just passed by Boston Fireboat Station with the red-trimmed buildings. And then we are now cruising by an area of the North End where there used to be a lot of rum distilleries. I talked about the changes in Boston's economy over the years. They used to sell a lot of rum, and they used to use a lot of alcohol production here to produce munitions from industrial alcohol. And so they needed molasses in order to produce this alcohol. So there was a 2 million gallon tank of molasses here. This tank of molasses one day, on a pretty hot January day, meaning maybe 60 degrees, this huge tank broke open. And the year was 1919, and they sent a 17-foot wave of molasses traveling 35 miles an hour down Commercial Street, which really makes you rethink the phrase slow as molasses. This was an enormous disaster. It killed dozens of people, dozens of horses, uprooted buildings from their foundations, and sank ships. A pretty sweet way to die, I guess, you know. Ooh. If you didn't like that pun, well, you see, the next day in the Boston Herald, they called it the Great Boston Molassacre. in pretty bad taste, if you ask me. You really shouldn't sugarcoat these kinds of things. Anyway, if you look up towards the skyline of Boston now, you can see many skyscrapers, right? Well, 50 years ago, there was only one. That one would be the Custom House Tower, with the clock faces on it and the green netting. In 1914, it was built on top of the Custom House. The Custom House was built in 1949. And when that was built, it was built on the shoreline of Boston. Yes, the shoreline has changed a lot. So the tower was added when there was a 125-foot height restriction on buildings. But the federal government built this structure, so they decided, well, how about 496 feet? That makes sense. Each of those 4 clock faces tells a different time. They all tell wrong times. And so for a time, it was called the four-faced liar. And if you were late for work, you might tell your boss, oh, shoot, well, I guess I was following the north clock today. Oops. Now these times are blown off because of the high winds here in Boston. Boston's one of the windiest cities in the country, windier than Chicago, believe it or not. Chicago is called the Windy City, but that's because of the politicians there. And that information comes directly from everyone from Chicago I've ever met on these boats. So if you look straight back at Long Wharf now, you can see the white flagpole. And I want to show you where the shoreline of Boston used to be. Because coming into view is the old State House, way down the street on the end of State Street. It is by the old State House that Long Wharf originally extended. The old State House was built in 1713 on the shoreline of Boston. They changed the shoreline over time through a process called the wharfing out of Boston, where they took wharves like Long Wharf and wharves like Central Wharf with the New England Aquarium stands. And they would build walls between the wharves, and then they would push earth into the space. They got this earth from the Shawmut Peninsula, where the Puritans first landed to settle Boston. There were 3 hills, Beacon Hill, Fort Hill, and Copp's Hill. You may have heard of some of them. Beacon Hill's 80 feet shorter than it used to be. Copp's Hill is much shorter as well, and Fort Hill is completely leveled. There were also many other hills around the area that were used in this process of wharfing out to cause the city to be quadrupled in size. Boston has been called a shining city on a hill, meant to be an example to all. And now it's a shining city on a whole bunch of different hills that are spread out in a huge area. On either side of the Shawmut Peninsula was Back Bay and South Bay. We cruised by South Boston. That's where the ICA was, and the Boston World Trade Center. Almost the entirety of that was once an area of water and is now land. And Back Bay, you may know as a huge area of the city on the other side of Beacon Hill. Yes, it is no longer a bay either. And they filled in that space during this process of wharfing out. Now, the old State House down at the end of Long Wharf, about 2,000 miles, I always make that mistake. It's not 2,000 miles, that's ridiculous. It's 2,000 feet from the flagpole. That was the site of the Boston Massacre. Now, the 2 main events that catalyzed the energy in the colonies to build up anger and frustration against the British Crown and cause the American Revolutionary War are the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. Because after the Boston Tea Party, King George sent 5,000 troops to occupy the colonies. These occupying forces were then, people were very upset with those forces after the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre took place because there was a colonist upset with a British soldier for not paying his bill. So he chased him down to the State House, where a group of patriots were throwing snowballs with rocks in them, and just rocks at these redcoats. And so then they called in for backup, and the huge crowd began to form, and someone started ringing the fire bell. And here's where things get a little fuzzy, because history is based on what primary sources and material we can pull together to form what is most accurate to the truth as we can tell. And so some sources say that someone was shouting fire in response to the fire bell, and that is what prompted the troops to fire. Other stories tell of a man who was struck in the leg with a rock, and as he rose, he was cursing, and he lowered his musket and fired over the crowd. And then when his commander came out and said, "Who gave you the order to fire?" The only word the rest of the troops heard was "the last one," and they all fired as well. 5 people died that day. Many were injured. It turned out that the British soldier had paid his bill after all. Now, the site of this is marked by a plaque that says this is the site of the Boston Massacre, but it's not at the actual location anymore. It was moved to the sidewalk by the State House where the troops were standing, but the deaths themselves happened in front of the building in what is now an intersection. And so they moved the plaque out of the way because the more people were getting hurt from taking pictures of it in the middle of an intersection than the massacre itself. Alright, we are approaching the end of our cruise here today. If you've had fun, we have a lot of other cruises like it, so recommend us to your friends. And if you didn't like it, then you could recommend us to your enemies. I'm fine with that. Again, my name is Ethan. Of course, unless you didn't like it, then my name is Jim. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I will be down on the gangway as you disembark this vessel to answer any questions or deal with any comments, concerns, or any feedback at all you might have. On behalf of Boston Harbor Cruises, the captain and the crew and myself, thank you all so much for joining us, and if you could just join me in a round of applause to thank our hardworking captain and crew today. Safe travels home, everyone. Farewell.